CPU temperature sensor wrong? Everest Ultimate is suddenly telling me that the CPU temperature and core temps for my E6850 Core 2 Duo is 72 degrees Celsius. When I stress test the machine, the temp goes up to 91 degrees and the CPU actually throttles. System remains stable though. For over a year now, my CPU has run very cool, 40s, with a large commercial copper heatsink/fan that I bought separately. To top it off, I removed the cover of the box and felt the CPU heatsink and it wasn't even warm. Is there such a thing as a CPU temp sensor showing the wrong readings? Any tips would help. Update number 1. Temp is also just as high in BIOS. So that leads me to believe it's a CPU seating issue, even though I used thermal paste to seat it 2 years ago when I built the machine. Update number 2. Well, I removed the heatsink and cleaned off the original thermal paste, which was somewhat crusty. I polished the surface, reapplied some new paste, and reseated the heatsink. After powering it up, there was no noticeable change in the temp, idling at 74. Ran the stress test and it went up to 94 degrees before being 100% throttled. I let it sit at 94 degrees for 20 minutes straight and the computer didn't even flinch. I then immediately shut it off and opened the case and felt around. The heatsink was completely cold to the touch. Even the copper rods were cold. The area near contact with the CPU was slightly warm but not hot to touch. Then I ran real temp, which is supposedly more accurate, and it told me the CPU was at 104 degrees. Lol. At this point, I'm thinking no doubt the CPU's sensor is wrong. Side note, the BIOS has the latest version so no option to flash there. Reverting hasn't been known to help from what I've read. What angers me is the false temps force the CPU to artificially throttle from 3 GHz down to 2 GHz and my CPU fan is cranking at full force all the time. Should I call Intel and tell them to send me another E6850? Solution update. I switched the processor out with another one and got the same obscene temperatures with the new processor, followed by a heatsink that was cool to touch. My suspicion in the heatsink was suddenly renewed. I swapped it out with the stock heatsink/fan and lo and behold the temperatures returned to the normal 35°C50°C. Even though the thermal paste was visibly flattened out every time I removed it, it looks like the heatsink was still not pressing hard enough on the CPU to effectively conduct the heat. The heatsink is a Mascool 8WA741, which screws into a standard position on the mount on the back of the Movo. Only thing I can surmise after 2 years of use was that, over time, the heatsink pressure on the CPU gave way until the heat began to be ineffectively conducted. Lessons learned. Intel CPUs can run super hot, upwards of 95°C, and still be stable. Heatsinks need to be very firmly pressed against the CPU to conduct heat.
If the fan is very cool and the processor is reporting very hot, I would first suspect the connection between the fan/heatsink and the processor package. Make sure the heatsink is properly seated with thermal paste. Let's get some terminology straight from Lavalize KB. CPU diode or core temperature is the temperature measured across a temperature-sensitive diode on the processor die. The most common implementation uses a temperature sensor part external to the processor with the CPU thermal diode anode, plus, and cathode, connections to it. CPU temperature is the temperature measured by a remote temperature sensor's part on the motherboard near the CPU. It is possible for these temperature sensors to fail, although I haven't seen it personally. Try installing a different processor and see if the readings are still incorrect. This can help point to where the problem lies. If the readings are okay, I would suspect your processor. If they are off as well, then suspect the parts on the board. Unfortunately, if it isn't the heatsink, there is no easy user fix other than replacing the offending part.
It could be a bad sensor, but I wouldn't wager on it. Check layer of conduction paste, seems like that could be the problem.
I had same overheating problem with Intel i5-661 and Asus P7H55 in Mobo. This has a push-fit heatsink and fan and one of the push-fit posts that come loose. PC was switching off at 93 Celsius. Fixed push-fit retaining post for fan and normal operation at 46 Celsius resumed.
Once you have LM sensors installed, make sure you run sensors detect from command line, which will detect your sensors and give you a more thorough readout. Another handy piece of code is a core temp script. Then you just type core temp into your terminal and it gives you real-time stats on each of your cores.
Si souvent on est aussi par la chaîne, puis je considère